What would you do if you had to marry a ruthless millionaire to save your family? She was pure, inexperienced, just 22 years old, and he, 17 years older, completely changed her heart. Tell me, where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This story will move you. Sometimes the walls most difficult to tear down are not those surrounding us, but those we build within ourselves. When Emily Taylor entered that immense office, with glass walls revealing all of New York City below, she felt her legs tremble. It wasn't exactly fear, but something close to it, a mixture of dread and resignation that made her want to run far away. But she couldn't. Her family depended on her, and that man seated behind the mahogany desk with grey eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul without any mercy was her only way out. The air conditioning blew too forcefully, creating a frigid environment that contrasted with the suffocating heat of the New York summer. The soles of her shoes, the only ones she had for special occasions bought 3 years earlier with her first waitressing paycheck, resonated against the polished marble as she advanced, conscious of every imperfection in her blue dress, every loose strand in her hastily arranged hair. James Wilson didn't even fully raise his face when she entered. At 39, he was a ruthless magnate who had built his empire from nothing, and the silver strands beginning to appear at his temples only accentuated that aura of power surrounding him. His fingers, long and elegant, slid a document across the polished surface of the desk. "Sign here," he said in a deep voice that reverberated through the walls. "The wedding will be in 3 days." Emily was only 22, recently graduated in literature from a small university in Connecticut. Her dreams included opening a cozy bookstore where children could sit on the floor covered with colorful pillows to listen to stories. She never imagined she would be there, negotiating her freedom as if it were just another business transaction. "May I read it first?" she asked, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. James raised his eyes for the first time. His eyes, the exact color of a storm about to break, fixed on hers. Emily noticed an almost imperceptible scar crossing his left eyebrow, a small defect on that perfectly chiseled face. "Of course," he replied with a touch of surprise. "I expected no less." Emily took the document between her trembling hands. Each word seemed like a sentence: marriage of convenience, public appearances, separate rooms, possible divorce after 5 years. Her father's debt would be settled immediately after signing. $17 million erased with a simple stroke of a pen. Her father had invested all the family's savings in a vineyard cooperative that promised to revolutionize wine production in the Napa Valley, but which ended up being just a well-orchestrated fraud. When the creditors came knocking, there was nothing left to do. And then he appeared, the ruthless businessman known for building empires and destroying competitors without blinking, offering to pay off the entire debt in exchange for a marriage of convenience. Emily scanned the document once more. Her right hand began to sweat around the Mont Blanc pen he had extended to her. The age difference between them, 17 years, was just one of the chasms that separated them. "Why me?" she finally asked, raising her eyes to meet his impenetrable gaze. "How you could have any woman you wanted." Something indecipherable crossed James's face, so fleeting that Emily thought she had imagined it. "I need a wife, not a lover," he responded coldly. "Someone discreet, with education, without excessive ambitions or media connections. Someone who understands the value of a deal." Emily felt those words like a stab in her chest. To him, she was nothing more than a convenient commodity. With what dignity she had left, she signed the document. The scratch of the pen on the paper sounded like a sentence. Outside, the sun was beginning to hide behind the skyscrapers of Fifth Avenue, tinting the sky a bloody red that filtered through the large windows, bathing the office with an almost supernatural light. "Welcome to your new life, Emily Wilson," he said, storing the contract in a locked drawer. She didn't respond. Inside her, something had broken irreparably, but also, although she didn't know it yet, something new was beginning to be born. The mansion where Emily began living in the exclusive Upper East Side seemed more like a golden prison than a home. Her room, a huge suite with a view of Central Park, where cherry blossoms bloomed and perfumed the air each spring, was decorated in ivory and gold tones, with period furniture and a bed so large it could accommodate an entire family. Despite the luxury, the cold infiltrated between the Egyptian cotton sheets each night. The corridors were long and silent, adorned with works by Pollock and Warhol that she didn't completely understand, and furniture so elegant that she was afraid to touch. In the first few days, she got lost several times trying to find the dining room or the kitchen. The staff, a silent army of employees with impeccable uniforms, appeared and disappeared as if by magic, keeping the house in perfect condition with barely noticeable presence. James barely spoke to her. Their interactions were limited to tense dinners, where the only sound was the clinking of silverware against fine porcelain. He left at dawn and returned late, sometimes when she had already retired to her room. One afternoon after a week of marriage, Emily decided to explore the house more deeply. She traversed rooms that seemed not to have been used in years. A music room with a grand piano covered by a thin layer of dust, a billiard room with perfectly aligned balls, an abandoned greenhouse where plants had dried up long ago. On the third floor, she found a half-open door that led to a room that definitely wasn't part of the official tour the housekeeper had shown her on the first day. Curiosity got the better of prudence. She gently pushed the door and held her breath. It was clearly James's personal office. Unlike the calculated coldness that dominated the rest of the house, this space revealed another type of personality. Shelves filled with books that occupied the walls from floor to ceiling, many of them clearly read and reread, an old worn leather armchair next to the window, a collection of antique clocks, and photographs, something she hadn't seen in any other part of the house. Emily approached cautiously. One of the images showed a boy of about 10, with the same dark hair and serious expression as James, seated next to a woman of serene beauty playing a guitar. The resemblance was undeniable. His mother. In another, a teenager received a chess prize, smiling timidly at the camera. "What are you doing here?" The cutting voice startled her so much that she dropped the frame she was holding. The glass shattered against the floor. James was at the entrance, with his tie loosened and his face tense with fury. His eyes landed on the fallen photograph, and then on her with an expression Emily couldn't interpret. Anger, pain, vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she stammered, instinctively bending down to pick up the pieces of glass. "The door was open and I—" "Leave it," he ordered, approaching with quick steps. "You'll cut yourself." But it was too late. A sharp fragment had embedded itself in Emily's finger. A drop of blood fell onto the photograph. James knelt beside her with abrupt movements. His hands, surprisingly gentle for a man with his reputation, took hers to examine the cut. "It's not deep," he murmured, taking an immaculate handkerchief from his pocket to wrap around her finger. "But it needs cleaning." Emily held her breath at that unexpected closeness. He smelled of sandalwood and something indefinable, a mixture of coffee and old paper. "It was your mother, wasn't it?" she asked in a whisper, indicating the photograph with her head. "You have her eyes." Something changed in James's expression. His features hardened again, as if he had remembered where he was and with whom. "Don't come back in here," he said, standing up and collecting the photograph with almost reverential care. "This place is forbidden. As a wife, you have freedom to move throughout the rest of the house, but my office is off limits. Understood?" Emily nodded, feeling how the wall between them was raised again, higher and more insurmountable than ever. "I'm sorry," she repeated, although she wasn't sure exactly what she was apologizing for entering without permission, for breaking the frame, or for having glimpsed, even if just for an instant, the man behind the mask. The library became Emily's refuge. It was a spacious room with large windows that looked out onto the back garden, where a marble fountain bubbled day and night. There she discovered literary treasures, first editions of Hemingway, complete collections of Jane Austen, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Edgar Allan Poe, ancient volumes of poetry bound in leather. In that space, surrounded by others' words that resonated with her own, she could pretend for a few hours that her life hadn't become an elaborate lie. There she wrote in a notebook she had brought with her from Connecticut, filling pages with reflections, poems, and fragments of stories that perhaps one day she would have the courage to complete. A month after the wedding, during a rainy afternoon that lashed against the windows with fury, Emily was absorbed in a copy of The Great Gatsby when the library door opened. She was startled to see James in the doorway, his hair damp and an indecipherable expression on his face. "I didn't know you would be here," he said, making a gesture to withdraw. "Don't go," she responded, surprising herself. "The library is big enough for both of us." James hesitated a moment, but finally entered and headed toward one of the most distant shelves. Emily watched him out of the corner of her eye as he selected a book and sat in an armchair by the opposite window. It was the first time they had shared a space without the formality of a meal or some social event they had to attend, as part of their marital charade. The silence between them, for the first time, didn't seem uncomfortable. Just the sound of pages turning and rain beating against the windows. After an hour, curiosity was stronger than prudence. "What are you reading?" Emily asked. James looked up, as if he had forgotten he wasn't alone. He hesitated an instant before showing the cover. The Odyssey in an old edition with green covers. "My father used to read it to me when I was a child," he said quietly, in a tone Emily had never heard, almost vulnerable. "Before everything changed." "What changed?" she asked, closing her own book and giving him her full attention. James looked at her for a long time, evaluating her. He seemed to make a decision. "My father was a brilliant man, but he trusted too much. He lost everything in a scam similar to what your father suffered." He paused, his eyes fixed on the rain hitting the windows. "The difference is he couldn't bear it. He took his own life when I was 18. Emily held her breath. She hadn't expected such a confession. "I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. "Don't be. He taught me the most important lesson. Never trust anyone. Never allow someone to have power over you." His fingers caressed the spine of the book in an almost unconscious gesture. "Though sometimes I miss the man I was before learning that lesson." Their gazes met across the room, and for an instant Emily glimpsed something in those grey eyes. Not the powerful businessman, but the boy who had once listened to stories of heroes and monsters on his father's knees. The revelation hung between them like a fragile bridge, a possibility of connection that neither knew how to completely cross. The ring of a cell phone broke the spell. James answered brusquely, and in seconds his face hardened again with the professional mask she knew so well. When he hung up, he rose and left the book on the small table. "I have a video conference with Tokyo," he announced, heading toward the door. "Don't wait up for dinner." When he left, Emily approached the armchair where he had been sitting. She took the Odyssey between her hands and opened it. On the first page, a handwritten dedication with already faded ink. "For James, because we are all Odysseus seeking our way back home. With love, Dad." Something trembled inside her. Perhaps there was more to James Wilson than his impenetrable facade revealed. The charity ball at the Metropolitan Opera was the most important social event of the season. Emily contemplated her reflection in the full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself. The intense red silk dress, designed exclusively for her by one of the most sought-after designers in America, fit her body like a second skin. Diamonds that had been loaned to her by the most exclusive jeweler in New York, another display of James's influence, adorned her neck and ears. The stylist and makeup artist hired for the occasion had worked for hours, transforming her into the sophisticated version expected of James Wilson's wife. Her hair, normally loose in natural waves, was now gathered in an elegant low chignon that enhanced her slender neck. The reflection returned an insecure gaze. The dress cost more than her family earned in a year, and though she knew she looked beautiful, she felt like an imposter. Her doll dressed for the role she was supposed to play. "You look perfect," James's voice startled her. He was at the door of the room, dressed in an impeccable tuxedo that accentuated his athletic figure. His eyes slowly traveled over Emily, with an expression she couldn't interpret. "I feel like a fraud," she confessed, avoiding his gaze. "Everyone will know I don't belong in this world." James approached. For the first time since they met, he took her hand with delicacy. The contact sent an electric current through Emily's arm. "Most people at this ball are the true frauds," he said, with a touch of bitterness. "Heirs who have never worked a day in their lives, businessmen who smile while planning backstabbing, socialites whose only skill is spending others' fortunes." He paused, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "You, at least, are authentic." Emily didn't know how to respond to that unexpected compliment. A knot formed in her throat. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. She nodded and took it, feeling the solidity of his presence as a strange consolation. The Metropolitan Opera was resplendent that night. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the main hall, where New York's elite gathered between glasses of champagne and studiously casual conversations. Emily felt all eyes on them as they advanced through the crowd. The women evaluated her dress, her hairstyle, her right to be on the arm of the country's most coveted man. The men measured James with a mixture of envy and respect. "Smile," he murmured near her ear. "They're waiting for you to fail, so they can tear you apart afterward." Emily composed her best smile, remembering the advice of the image consultant James had hired to prepare her. Straight back, chin slightly raised, small but confident steps. During the first hour, she managed to navigate the superficial conversations without major difficulties. James remained by her side, intervening when the topic deviated toward business or political matters. She noticed how his face transformed in these moments, acquiring that calculated hardness that made him feared in boardrooms. The tension broke when an elegant woman, laden with jewels that sparkled under the crystal lights, approached with a sharp smile. "James, darling, what a surprise to see you accompanied," she said with false sweetness. "And with a wife, no less. All of New York is talking about your sudden marriage." "Jessica," he responded with courteous coldness. "This is Emily, my wife." The woman evaluated Emily from head to toe with barely disguised disdain. "It must be difficult for you, darling, coming from nowhere, trying to fit into this world," she commented loudly enough for others to hear. "I bet you don't even know which wine to order." Emily felt the blood rise to her face, tears burning in her eyes. The gazes of those present weighed on her like tombstones. She wanted to sink, disappear, run far from this world to which she clearly didn't belong. But before she could respond, she felt James's hand under the table, the first time he had touched her voluntarily in public, squeezing hers firmly. When he spoke, his voice had an icy edge that cut like a knife. "My wife has more class in a single strand of hair than you'll have in your entire life, Jessica," he said, with a coldness that made everyone around hold their breath. "I suggest you withdraw before I remind everyone present how you really obtained your art collection." The woman paled and hurried away. The witnesses pretended not to have heard the exchange, but the message was clear. No one should mess with James Wilson's wife. Emily looked at her husband, astonished by that unexpected defense, and for the first time, she saw something different in his grey eyes, a protective flame that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. "Thank you," she whispered when they were relatively alone. James didn't respond, but he didn't release her hand for the rest of the evening. The discovery came unexpectedly, as the most important truths often do. Emily was helping Mrs. Jenkins, the grey-haired housekeeper with a southern accent who had worked in the house for decades, fold lavender-scented sheets for the linen closet. It was a task she had insisted on doing herself, despite the initial protests of the staff, who considered it improper for the mistress to perform domestic chores. "You have soft hands, ma'am," commented Mrs. Jenkins, observing how Emily carefully smoothed the wrinkles of the fabric, like those of a child. "They weren't made for heavy work." "My mother's hands are full of calluses," Emily responded with a melancholy smile. "She always said they were medals of honor, earned by cleaning other people's houses so I could study." Mrs. Jenkins looked at her with an indecipherable expression, a mixture of approval and curiosity. "You know, the master also comes from humble origins, though few would know that today," she said quietly, as if sharing a secret. "His grandfather was a miner in West Virginia. His father managed to study engineering and founded a small company that grew more than expected." Emily held her breath. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her about James's family history. "And what happened to them?" she asked cautiously. "He never mentions them." Mrs. Jenkins looked at the door, making sure they were alone. When she spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "He was abandoned by his family when he was only 18, the woman revealed, after a devastating conflict over the direction of the business. His father wanted to sell the company to a multinational. He opposed, insisting they should keep it independent. The argument became so bitter that his parents and younger brother completely rejected him, cutting all ties." "They left him alone?" asked Emily, trying to imagine the pain of such rejection. "They went to live in Australia without even leaving a contact address," confirmed Mrs. Jenkins, her ancient eyes full of a sadness that seemed to have been kept for years. "The master had a small apartment he had bought with his first savings. He locked himself in there for weeks. When he came out, he was another man, cold, calculating, obsessed with success. In 10 years, he built an empire greater than what his father had ever dreamed. Emily felt something breaking inside her. Suddenly, many things about James began to make sense. His distrust, his emotional walls, his apparent inability to connect with others. "Why are you telling me this, Mrs. Jenkins?" The elderly woman folded the last sheet with precise movements before answering. "Because for 20 years I've watched that young man consume himself from within," she said, with the frankness that only advanced age permits. "And you are the first person I've seen break through his defenses, though he himself hasn't realized it yet." That night, Emily observed James during dinner with new eyes. She looked for traces of the wounded adolescent who had to reinvent himself after such a profound betrayal in his face. She found them in small details. The way his fingers drummed on the table when he was thoughtful, the way he avoided certain topics, the way he sometimes stared into space when he thought no one was watching. "Is something wrong?" he asked, catching her persistent gaze. "You've barely touched your dinner." Emily wanted to tell him she understood, that she too knew what it was like to feel abandoned, albeit in different ways. She wanted to extend a bridge to that lonely place where he had lived for so long, but the right words didn't come to her mouth. "I was thinking about making some changes to the house," she said finally, "if you agree." James raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What kind of changes?" "Nothing structural," she clarified, nervously playing with her napkin. "Just making it more welcoming. Plants, maybe. Some color." She expected resistance, but he simply nodded. "It's your house too," he said, returning to his food. "Do what you think appropriate. Margaret will give you access to the account for household expenses." A small step, thought Emily. A tiny bridge extended across the abyss. Emily began making small changes to the mansion. She brought plants for the empty corners, red geraniums in terracotta pots, jasmine that perfumed the air with a subtle sweetness, small cacti that added a touch of life to the windowsills. She changed some of the heavy curtains for lighter ones that let in natural light. She placed colorful pillows on the dark leather sofas in the main living room. The staff observed her with a mixture of curiosity and silent approval. The house, which for years had been a cold and formal space, was beginning to breathe. She also started frequenting the kitchen, territory that until then had been under the absolute domain of the private chef hired by James. Initially, the man showed wariness toward her intrusions, but when he discovered Emily didn't intend to criticize, but rather learn and occasionally prepare some simple dishes herself, the tension dissipated. "My grandmother taught me to cook when I was little," she explained one afternoon, while learning to make a saffron sauce under his tutelage. She said food was a universal language of love. The chef, a serious man of about 50 who rarely smiled, nodded with an expression that could almost be interpreted as approval. "My mother used to say something similar," he confessed, though in her case, it was more a matter of survival in a town where hunger was frequent. Emily began preparing some simple dishes from her childhood. Pot roast that filled the kitchen with aromas of beef and herbs, homemade apple pie with a cinnamon crust, warm chocolate chip cookies that melted in the mouth. At first, James rejected these culinary incursions, insisting he preferred the food prepared by the chef. But one night, after a particularly difficult day at the office, Emily found him in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, eating a piece of peach cobbler she had made that afternoon, with silent tears sliding down his face. He didn't see her, hidden as she was in the shadows of the hallway, and she said nothing. But in that moment she understood that behind the armor was a deeply wounded man who had used all those years of solitude to build barriers that now seemed insurmountable. The next morning during breakfast, James casually mentioned, "The cobbler was good." Emily contained a smile, merely nodding. "It was my grandmother's recipe," she responded, without mentioning she had seen him the night before. "She used to make it whenever any of us had a difficult day." Their gazes met briefly across the table. Something tacit passed between them, a mutual recognition that neither dared put into words yet. The most significant change came on a Sunday afternoon. Emily was in the back garden, reading in the shade of an old maple tree, when James appeared dressed in casual clothes, something she had rarely seen him wear, and carrying a toolbox. "What are you doing?" she asked, closing her book. "I saw you had bought herb seeds," he responded with some discomfort, as if unsure of his role in this situation. "I thought we could build a small garden for them." Emily looked at him in astonishment. It was the first time James had proposed doing something together, something as simple and everyday as planting herbs. "I'd love that," she said, rising with a smile she didn't try to disguise. They spent the afternoon digging, preparing the soil, planting seeds of rosemary, thyme, basil, and mint. James, who had always seemed so meticulous and distant from physical work, had hands stained with earth, and a concentration expression that Emily found inexplicably moving. "My grandfather had a garden," he commented while flattening the earth around a small lavender plant. "He used to take me there when I was a child. He taught me that patience was the most important virtue. Nature is never in a hurry, yet everything is accomplished," he would say. It was the first time he had voluntarily shared a happy memory of his past. Emily treasured it as the precious gift it was. When they finished, sweaty and tired but with a strange satisfaction, they contemplated their work, a small rectangle of earth where, with luck, fragrant herbs would soon grow. "There's something comforting about creating something with your hands," said James, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "Something real, tangible. Something alive," added Emily. "Something that grows." Their eyes met, and for an instant, all barriers seemed to vanish. Emily saw the man behind the ruthless businessman, someone who yearned for connection, but who had learned to fear the pain it could bring. The moment broke when James's phone rang. He answered with a furrowed brow, instantly returning to his professional persona. When he hung up, his face had recovered its usual mask. "I have to go to the office," he said, gathering the tools. "An emergency with the American acquisition." "It's Sunday," Emily protested, before she could stop herself. "Markets don't understand weekdays," he responded, though for the first time he seemed genuinely displeased about having to leave. When he left, Emily remained in the garden, observing the small plot they had created together. It was just a beginning, a tiny space of shared earth, but it was something. And as James's grandfather had said, with patience, everything is accomplished. 6 months after the wedding, during an unusually cold morning for October, James entered the library where Emily was writing in her notebook. "I need to go to Miami on business," he announced, stopping next to her armchair. "I want you to accompany me." It wasn't a request, but not exactly an order either. There was a nuance in his voice that Emily had learned to recognize, a vulnerability camouflaged as authority. "When would we leave?" she asked, closing her notebook. "Tomorrow morning. We'll be there for 3 days." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. They had never traveled together. In fact, they had barely left the house except for social events, where they had to maintain the facade of a perfect marriage. They departed at dawn in James's Aston Martin, with New York still asleep behind them. The journey passed mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Emily observed the changing landscape through the window, while James drove with the precision and concentration that characterized all his actions. They stayed at a boutique hotel in South Beach, where the bells of century-old churches rang every hour, and the aroma of the sea mingled with the smell of Cuban food being prepared in the neighborhood restaurants. Their suite had a view of a small, tree-lined plaza, where street musicians played jazz under the stars. "The meeting is tomorrow at 10, James informed her as they unpacked. "I've reserved a spa for you during that time, if you'd like." Emily was surprised by that thoughtful gesture. "Thank you, but I'd prefer to explore the city if you don't mind," she responded. "It's been years since I've been to Miami." James nodded, not pressing the issue. That first night, they dined at a small restaurant away from tourist routes, recommended by the hotel concierge. The place, only lit by candles and with low ceilings of ancient beams, served traditional Florida cuisine with a modern touch. For the first time since they met, conversation flowed effortlessly between them, perhaps facilitated by the excellent red wine and intimate atmosphere. "What did you want to be when you were little?" James asked while they shared a key lime pie dessert. The question, so simple and personal at the same time, caught Emily by surprise. No one in her new life had asked about her childhood dreams. "I wanted to open a children's bookstore," she confessed with a nostalgic smile. "A cozy place where children could sit on colorful cushions to listen to stories. I had even designed how it would be. Low shelves so the little ones could reach the books, a corner with a tree painted on the wall where we would do readings, Maybe a cat that lived there and let itself be petted. She interrupted herself, suddenly conscious of how distant that dream was from her current reality. "And you?" she asked, trying to divert attention. "Did you always want to be a businessman?" James rotated his glass between his fingers, observing how the candlelight reflected in the wine. "I wanted to be an architect," he responded after a moment, "to design spaces that could change the way people live, that would make them feel safe and yet inspired." "What happened to that dream?" "Life," he said simply, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Circumstances." They returned to the hotel walking, their steps resonating in the narrow, ancient streets. The night was warm for October, the air impregnated with sea salt and the distant echo of music. Without planning, their hands brushed while they walked. Neither pulled away. The next morning, while James was in his meeting, Emily explored the neighborhood. She visited the Art Deco district, lost herself in colonial alleyways, stopped to listen to a violinist interpreting Gershwin under a century-old arch. She bought books in a tiny bookstore specializing in poetry and found a small silver brooch in the shape of a feather that, on impulse, she purchased for James. At noon, she received a text message. Meeting cancelled. The investor had a family emergency. Lunch together. They met at a restaurant by the sea. James seemed different, more relaxed than Emily had ever seen him, as if Miami had temporarily dissolved some of his defenses. "What do we do now?" she asked when they finished eating. "Return to New York? We have the room reserved until tomorrow," he responded, surprising her. "Why not take advantage? It's the first time in years I don't have any meetings, any commitments." The afternoon passed like a dream. They strolled along Ocean Drive as the sky began to tinge with intense oranges and pinks. They visited the Vizcaya Museum, where James bought strawberries they shared as they walked. They climbed to a rooftop bar, where they contemplated the city under the sunset light, seated with cocktails overlooking the shimmering Biscayne Bay. Emily talked about her childhood dreams, about how she used to read Harry Potter stories to her younger siblings, using different voices for each character, making them laugh until their stomachs hurt. And he, for the first time, talked about his mother, a woman who loved folk music and played guitar every afternoon, filling the house with melodies he could still hear when he closed his eyes. "She died when I was 15, he said, looking toward the horizon where the sun sank into the Atlantic. "Cancer. It was quick, barely 3 months from diagnosis. My father never recovered. I think part of him died with her." Emily took his hand and squeezed it gently. There were no adequate words for that kind of loss. When they returned to the hotel, something had changed between them. An invisible barrier had crumbled, revealing possibilities that neither had dared to contemplate before. They dined on the hotel terrace, under a sky sprinkled with stars. They shared memories, discovered common tastes, laughed for the first time with authentic freedom. And when Emily took out the small silver brooch and timidly handed it to him, James held it between his fingers, as if it were the most precious object in the world. "No one has given me a gift in years," he said in a husky voice. "Not something personal, chosen especially for me." That night, in front of the door to their shared room, they looked at each other with a new awareness of each other. James brushed her cheek with soft fingers, a gesture so tender that Emily felt something breaking and being reborn simultaneously within her. "Good night, Emily," he whispered. "Good night, James." They slept in separate beds, as they had always done. But something fundamental had changed. The wall that separated them had begun to crack, and through those cracks a new light filtered, illuminating possibilities that neither had imagined when they signed that cold marriage contract 6 months earlier. The peace was ephemeral. When they returned to New York, they discovered that David Thompson, the partner James had trusted for years, had betrayed him. During their absence, he had leaked privileged information to the competition and diverted company funds to overseas accounts, putting at risk not only the financial stability of the business group, but also its reputation. Emily observed helplessly as James transformed back into the cold and distant man she had met at the beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, legal processes, sleepless nights. She saw him wearing himself down, getting thinner, paler, more distant. The bridge they had begun to build in Miami seemed to have vanished like a mirage in the desert. One night, almost a month after David's betrayal, Emily went down to the kitchen past midnight, unable to sleep. To her surprise, she found James seated at the kitchen table with a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. His usual composure had disappeared. His tie loosened, his hair disheveled, his eyes reddened by fatigue and alcohol. "You shouldn't be awake," he said upon seeing her, his voice slightly slurred. "It's late." "Neither should you," she responded softly, sitting across from him. "And you definitely shouldn't be drinking alone." James sketched a bitter smile. "Isn't that how betrayal is supposed to be drowned? At the bottom of a bottle?" Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she rose and put water to boil. In silence, she prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea and placed one in front of James, discreetly moving away the whiskey bottle. "Betrayal isn't drowned," she said finally. "It's survived." He looked at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been betrayed too," she responded with simplicity. "Not in the same way as you, but enough to know that the pain passes. It doesn't disappear, but it transforms into something you can live with." James took a sip of tea, grimacing at the contrast with the whiskey. "I trusted him," he said in a broken voice. "David was my friend for 15 years. He was by my side when I built the company from nothing. He knew my family, dined in my home, knew all my secrets." "I'm so sorry," said Emily, resisting the impulse to take his hand. "Betrayed trust is the most difficult wound to heal." James let out a humorless laugh. "You know what's worst?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the cup. "That a part of me always knew this could happen. That everyone at some point betrays. My parents did it. And now David. I should have expected it." "Not everyone betrays, James," Emily said firmly. "Not everyone is like your parents, or like David." "No?" His gaze rose, challenging. "What about you, Emily? Wouldn't you betray me if you had the opportunity? If tomorrow I told you that your father's debt is completely settled and that you're free to leave, wouldn't you run out that door without looking back?" The question hung between them, charged with an emotion that went far beyond words. Emily felt her response would define something crucial in their relationship. "6 months ago, I probably would have," she admitted honestly. "But now I'm not so sure." Something changed in James's expression, a vulnerability that briefly crossed his armor before he hid behind it again. "You should go to bed," he said, averting his gaze. "I need to be at the office early tomorrow." Emily stood, but instead of heading for the door, she rounded the table and stopped beside him. Without thinking too much, she rested a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You're not alone in this, James," she said softly. "Not anymore." He didn't respond, but for an instant his hand rose and covered hers, a brief contact that conveyed more than any words. That night, lying in her bed, Emily understood with crystal clarity what she had been feeling for weeks. She had fallen in love with James, not with the powerful businessman, not with the millionaire feared in New York business circles, but with the wounded man who hid his vulnerability behind expensive suits and endless meetings. With the man who secretly left presents for her, who protected her honor even when she herself didn't know how to defend it, who carried such a deep pain that he had forgotten how to feel joy. The age difference that at the beginning had seemed an insurmountable obstacle was now just an insignificant detail compared to the connection that had flourished between them. The marriage contract, which had begun as a cold and calculated transaction, now seemed a cruel irony. She was legally bound to the man she loved, but emotionally separated from him by walls he himself had built over decades. Emily fell asleep to the sound of rain hitting against the windows, wondering if she would ever find the courage to confess her feelings, and if he, in turn, would be capable of lowering his defenses enough to accept them. David's betrayal had devastating consequences. The company's shares plummeted, investors began to withdraw, and the media, which had always observed James with a mixture of admiration and wariness, now delighted in his apparent fall. "The Wilson Empire wavers," said the headlines. "The end of the Midas King?" Others speculated. The photographs of James captured with telephoto lenses when he left meetings or the courthouse showed a man whose impeccable image was beginning to crack, deep dark circles, tense expression, ties that no longer seemed perfectly adjusted. Emily suffered in silence, watching the man she loved consuming himself day by day. James barely slept, barely ate. He spent endless hours locked in his office, emerging only to attend crucial meetings or to collapse exhausted on the library sofa, often without reaching his bedroom. On a particularly cold morning in December, Emily received a call that left her chilled. It was Margaret, James's personal assistant. "Mrs. Wilson, Mr. James fainted during a meeting. He's been taken to New York Presbyterian Hospital." Emily arrived at the hospital in record time, her heart beating so hard she believed it would burst from her chest. They found her in the waiting room, where a doctor with a serious aspect informed her that James had suffered a collapse from extreme exhaustion and dehydration. "Your husband is working himself to exhaustion," said the doctor, adjusting his glasses. "His body simply can't take any more. He needs absolute rest for at least 2 weeks. No work, no stress." Emily nodded, knowing how difficult it would be to make James follow these instructions. When she was finally allowed to see him, her heart tightened. James was lying in the hospital bed, connected to IVs with a paleness that accentuated the sharp angles of his face. He seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable, stripped of all the symbols of power that normally surrounded him. "You shouldn't have come," were his first words upon seeing her. "I'm perfectly fine, it was just an unimportant discomfort." Emily approached the bed, resisting the impulse to take his hand. "You fainted in the middle of a meeting with the board of directors," she said softly. "That's hardly unimportant." "I need to get back to the office," he insisted, trying to sit up. "The restructuring vote is tomorrow. The only part of your body going anywhere is your head on this pillow," Emily responded with a firmness that surprised him. "For the first time in your life, James Wilson, you're going to do exactly as you're told." Their gazes met in a silent duel. Finally, to Emily's astonishment, he yielded, sinking back into the pillows with a sigh of defeat. "And who will take care of everything?" he asked, closing his eyes. "The company is on the brink of collapse. If I'm not present for that vote—" "Richard can represent you," suggested Emily, referring to the company's vice president, the only one in James's inner circle who hadn't been involved in David's betrayal. "You trust him, don't you?" James opened his eyes, studying her with an indecipherable expression. "Since when do you know so much about the structure of my company?" Emily blushed slightly. "I've been paying attention," she admitted. "When you talk on the phone, when you mention names, plus I've been reading about the case in the press." A hint of a smile appeared on James's lips. "Seems I married a spy," he murmured. "Someone who cares about you," she corrected, feeling a sudden courage. "Though sometimes it seems you're the only one who doesn't notice." The comment hung between them, laden with implications neither was prepared to fully address. James remained in the hospital for 2 days, and when he finally returned home, it was under the strict condition that he would get absolute rest for at least a week. Emily reorganized his room so he would have everything he might need within reach: books, the laptop, though only for movies, she had insisted, water, snacks. She even moved a small television so he could follow economic news, her only concession to his work obsession. The first days were a constant battle. James, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life and his company, rebelled against the restrictions, constantly trying to make calls in secret or check emails when he thought Emily wasn't looking. "If you don't put down that phone, I swear I'll throw it out the window," she warned on the 3rd night, catching him consulting stock market graphs at 2 in the morning. "And you'll have to explain to your shareholders why you're incommunicado." James looked at her with a mixture of irritation and something that might have been admiration. "You're more stubborn than I thought," he said, reluctantly handing her the device. "I learned from the best," she responded, storing the phone in the pocket of her robe. Little by little, as the forced rest began to take effect, James started to relax. Color returned to his cheeks. The perpetual tension in his shoulders eased. Emily spent hours with him, reading in silence while he napped, or discussing the books they had both read, or simply watching old black and white films that, they discovered, they both loved. One afternoon while they were watching Casablanca, James asked without taking his eyes from the screen, "Why are you doing all this, Emily?" She felt her heart accelerate. Was this the moment of truth? "What do you mean?" "Taking care of me," he clarified, his voice unusually soft. "Worrying. Our agreement didn't include you becoming my personal nurse." Emily breathed deeply, gathering courage. "Maybe I'm not following the terms of that agreement anymore," she said finally, looking him directly in the eyes. "Maybe I haven't been for some time." Something shone in James's eyes, an emotion so intense Emily almost had to look away. He extended his hand and took hers, a gesture so simple yet so laden with meaning that she felt the world stopping around her. But before either could say anything more, the landline phone rang, breaking the spell. It was Richard, with news about the company. The main investors had decided to maintain their support, shares were beginning to recover, and the district attorney had found conclusive evidence against David, which completely exonerated James from any suspicion of complicity. When he hung up, James seemed a transformed man. Relief had softened his features, and for the first time in weeks, Emily saw a genuine smile illuminating his face. "Seems we'll survive after all," he said, looking at her with a new light in his eyes. Emily smiled in turn, feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. The business crisis had been devastating, but it had also knocked down barriers that otherwise might have remained standing for years. In the vulnerability forced by physical and emotional collapse, James had begun to allow himself to feel, to allow himself to need someone else. And Emily, who had entered that marriage as a prisoner, now found herself voluntarily chained to a man whose wounded soul she had come to understand and love deeply. As James recovered physically, and the business crisis began to stabilize, a new tension arose between them. The moment of emotional intimacy they had shared during his convalescence had opened a door that neither knew how to fully cross. They returned to a routine similar to the one before the crisis, but now laden with unreturned glances, conversations that abruptly interrupted when they touched on topics too personal, and a constant dance of approaches and withdrawals that left both emotionally exhausted. One afternoon in January, Emily was in the library trying to concentrate on a book of poetry by Robert Frost when James entered. He wore an impeccable dark suit. He had returned to work the previous week, though with a reduced schedule at the doctor's insistence. "I need to talk to you," he said, with a formality that made Emily feel a knot in her stomach. "Has something happened?" she asked, closing the book and straightening in the armchair. James remained standing, as if he needed the advantage of height for what he was about to say. "I've been thinking a lot these past weeks," he began, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture Emily had rarely seen him make. "About us. About this marriage." Emily held her breath. Was this the moment when they would finally acknowledge what had grown between them? Or, on the contrary, had James decided it was time to end an agreement that no longer made sense to him? "Your father's debt is completely settled," he continued, avoiding her gaze. "It's been more than half a year since we signed that contract. The original conditions have been fulfilled." Emily's heart painfully constricted. So that was it. The moment of dissolution had arrived. "I understand," she said, proud that her voice didn't betray the emotional storm she felt inside. "You want a divorce?" The word hung between them, heavy and definitive. James finally looked at her, and Emily was surprised to see conflict in his eyes, not the calculating coldness she expected. "I want you to be free to decide," he responded. "I don't want you to remain tied to me by a contract or out of gratitude, or for any reason other than your own will." Emily blinked, confused by the unexpected turn in the conversation. "You're giving me the option to leave." James nodded slowly. "I'm releasing you from our original agreement," he clarified. "What you decide to do with that freedom," his voice faltered slightly, "depends entirely on you." Emily stood, reducing the physical distance between them, though the emotional one still seemed insurmountable. "And what is it that you want, James?" she asked directly. "Not what you think is right or noble to offer, what you truly desire." He looked away, and for an instant seemed as vulnerable as when he was prostrate in that hospital bed. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm afraid of wanting too much, Emily. All my life, every time I've wanted something with too much intensity, I've lost it." That confession, so simple and yet so devastating, broke her heart. Emily understood then the magnitude of the damage life had inflicted on this man. Not only had he been taught not to trust, but also to fear his own desires, to consider longing as a dangerous weakness. "Sometimes," she said softly, taking another step closer, "we have to risk wanting, even knowing we might lose." James raised his gaze, and Emily saw in his eyes a conflict so deep she could almost feel the physical pain it caused him. "I don't know if I can," he completed, briefly closing his eyes. "I don't know if I have the strength to risk losing you." The confession, so sincere and stripped of the usual barriers, left Emily breathless. It was the first time James had admitted, even if indirectly, that she meant something to him, something important enough to fear its loss. "What if you don't lose me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if I stay, not because of a contract or out of gratitude, but because I want to be here, because I choose to be with you?" James opened his eyes, and the intensity of his gaze almost made her step back. "Is that what you want?" he asked in a husky voice. "After how all this began, after how I forced you into my life," Emily took the last step, eliminating the distance between them. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she took James's hands in hers. "What began as an obligation has changed, James. For both of us, I think, and I want to discover what it has become." A dense silence enveloped them, charged with possibilities. Emily could feel James's accelerated pulse, see the internal battle he was waging with himself. Just when she thought she had spoken too frankly, that she had misinterpreted the signals, James released her hands, but only to frame her face with a gentleness that contrasted with his usual control. "I want to discover it too," he whispered. Their faces moved closer slowly, as if drawn by an inexorable force. When their lips met, it wasn't with the unbridled passion Emily had imagined in her most private moments, but with an almost painful tenderness, as if both feared the other might vanish at the slightest contact. The kiss was brief, but it contained a promise, a beginning. When they separated, Emily saw something in James's eyes that she had never seen before: hope. "I have a proposal," he said, without releasing her face. "A new agreement. But this time on equal terms." "I'm listening," she responded, containing a smile. "I propose we give ourselves 6 months, he explained. 6 months to really get to know each other, to decide if what we feel can become something lasting. No pressures, no external expectations, just us." Emily nodded, understanding James's need to structure even this, to give shape to what was being born between them. It was his way of maintaining some control in a territory where he felt completely lost. "I accept," she said, sealing their new agreement with another brief kiss. 6 months. That night, for the first time, they dined in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. They cooked together. A simple pasta with tomato sauce and basil from the small garden they had planted months ago. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, rediscovering each other under this new light. And when the time came to retire, they paused in the hallway that separated their bedrooms, hesitant. "Good night, Emily," James said finally, softly kissing her forehead. "Good night, James." Each went to their own room, but something fundamental had changed. The mansion that had been a prison, then a refuge, now began to feel like a shared home, and the walls that James had built around his heart for decades were finally beginning to crumble. Spring arrived in New York with an explosion of colors and aromas. The small herb garden they had planted together had expanded to include cherry tomatoes, bell peppers, and various flowers. Emily spent hours there, reading in the shade of a young cherry tree that James had planted as a surprise for her birthday. The months passed in a new dynamic between them. They advanced slowly, with the caution of two people who have been deeply hurt and fear new disappointment. They kissed more frequently, held hands when they walked through the garden, shared confidences during long nocturnal conversations, but they still maintained separate bedrooms, a last redoubt of independence that neither felt prepared to abandon yet. One morning in April, while they breakfasted on the terrace, James set his coffee cup on the table with a decisive gesture. "I've been thinking," he began, with that expression of concentration Emily had learned to recognize. "This house has never really been a home." Emily looked at him in surprise. During the last few months, with the small changes they had both introduced, the mansion had acquired a certain warmth it previously lacked. "What do you mean?" she asked, setting aside her toast with homemade jam. "I bought it because it was what was expected of someone in my position," James explained. "Large, ostentatious, in the right neighborhood, but I never felt it was mine. And then you came, and you filled it with plants and colors and life." He paused, searching for the right words. "But it continues to be a monument to the man I thought I should be, not to who I might become." Emily held her breath, intuiting he was about to propose something important. "What do you want to do about it?" James's eyes shone with renewed determination. "I want us to start anew, in a place we choose together. A space that reflects who we are now, not who I was for 20 years of solitude. The proposal left her speechless. It wasn't simply the idea of moving, but what it symbolized. James was willing to abandon the fortress he had built, to protect himself from the world, to take a step toward a shared life. Where? Was all she managed to ask. I was thinking of the Hamptons, he responded. There's a house there I saw years ago, when I still dreamed of different things. Smaller than this one, but with a huge garden and views of the sea. Close enough to New York to go back and forth when necessary, but far from the noise and appearances. Emily could see it in her mind, a tranquil place where they could build something together, far from the pressures of the world to which James had belonged for so long, a refuge but not a prison. I'd love to see it, she said, taking his hand across the table. They visited the house that same weekend. It was a 2-story stone construction with wooden ceilings, surrounded by century-old pine trees, and with a creek that crossed the back of the property. It needed renovations and care, but it had soul, that indefinable quality Emily had always associated with a true home. It's quite deteriorated, James warned as they traversed the rooms, where light filtered through dusty windows. It would take months to make it habitable. It's perfect, Emily responded, stopping before a stone fireplace in what had once been the living room. It has history, character. It just needs someone to love it again. They looked at each other, both conscious of the parallel with their own lives. They bought the house the following week. The subsequent months passed in a whirlwind of plans, decisions, and changes. James surprised everyone, including Emily, by delegating more responsibilities in his company, reducing his workday to personally supervise the renovation of the house. Together they chose materials, designed spaces, imagined how their life would be there. One afternoon, while they discussed the color for the walls of what would be their shared library, Emily casually mentioned, I always wanted to have a bookstore, you know. Something small, cozy, where children could come to hear stories. James looked at her thoughtfully. Why don't you do it? He asked. There's an available space in the historic center of Southampton, just 20 minutes from the house. It could be perfect for a children's bookstore. Emily looked at him incredulously. Are you serious? Completely, he affirmed. You have the talent, the passion, and now the resources. What's stopping you? The answer was as simple as it was terrifying. Fear. Fear of failing, of discovering that her lifelong dream wasn't as satisfying as she had imagined. But looking at James, she saw in his eyes that unwavering faith he had begun to have in her, and knew it was time to be brave. Nothing, she responded finally. Nothing is stopping me anymore. By the end of summer, when the work on the house was almost complete, Emily signed the rental contract for what would become The Story Corner, a small bookstore specializing in children's literature, with a space dedicated to readings and workshops for children. James was by her side throughout the process, supporting her without intervening, allowing the project to be completely hers. You know what my father told me when I said I wanted to study literature? Emily confided to him one night, while reviewing the book catalogue for the inaugural order, that it was a sure path to poverty, that I would never be able to support myself with it. And what did you tell him? Asked James, intrigued by this fragment of her past he didn't know. That I preferred to be poor doing what I loved, than rich hating every minute of my life. She smiled nostalgically. I was very idealistic then. James took her hand and kissed it softly. And you still are, he said. It's one of the things I love most about you. The words hung between them, resonating in the silence. It was the first time either had used that word. Love. Emily looked at him, her heart pounding. Do you mean it? James nodded, holding her gaze with a vulnerability that months ago would have been unthinkable. I've been looking for the perfect moment to tell you for weeks, he confessed. Some grandiose gesture, some special occasion, but then I realized that perhaps the most sincere thing was simply to say it when I felt it so strongly that I could no longer contain it. Emily moved closer and took his face between her hands. I love you, James Wilson, she said in a clear and firm voice. Not the powerful businessman nor the millionaire, but the man who plants cherry trees as a surprise, who remembers how I like my coffee, who looks at me as if I were the most valuable thing in the world. They kissed under the soft light of the desk lamp, surrounded by lists of children's books and plans for bookshelves. It wasn't the perfect moment James had imagined, but one infinitely better, authentic, spontaneous, as imperfect and real as the love that had blossomed between them. The last barrier fell that night, when for the first time they shared not only their hearts, but also the same bed. The next morning they awoke entwined as if their bodies had been waiting years to finally find each other. "Do you know what day it is today?" asked James, caressing her hair as the dawn light filtered through the curtains. Emily shook her head, still drowsy. "Exactly 6 months have passed since our new agreement," he said with a smile. "Have you made your decision?" She propped herself up on an elbow to look at him directly. "I made it a long time ago," she responded. "I choose you, James. Today and every day." The smile that illuminated James's face contained all the hopes and promises of a man who, after decades of solitude, had finally found his way back home. The house in the Hamptons was completed just as autumn began to paint the surrounding forests in ochres and reds. It was a warm and luminous space, with large windows that framed views of the sea, wooden floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, and a spacious kitchen where Emily experimented with traditional American recipes she collected from the town's elderly ladies. The move from the Upper East Side mansion was like a purification ritual. They took only the essentials, the books they both loved, some art pieces with special meaning, framed photographs of the moments they had shared during that year of transformation. The rest, the ostentatious furniture, the impersonal ornaments, all the symbols of the old James, they donated or sold. The Story Corner opened its doors in Southampton in early October. Emily had created exactly the space she had always dreamed of. Low shelves so children could reach the books, a corner with a tree painted on the wall where readings were held, multicolored cushions scattered on the floor, and even a cat, a calm, striped animal named Atticus, that had installed itself in the shop window, as if the place had always belonged to it. On Thursday afternoons, Emily organized storytelling sessions that soon became popular. Children from the neighborhood and nearby towns sat in a circle while she read them stories of knights and dragons, brave princesses, and misunderstood witches, using different voices for each character, as she used to do with her younger siblings. "I've never seen you like this," James commented one afternoon after witnessing one of these sessions from a discreet corner of the bookstore. "Like what?" Emily asked as she arranged the cushions that had been left in disarray after the children's stampede. "So fully yourself," he responded with simplicity, "as if all the pieces of your being had finally fit together." Emily smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. She had found her place in the world, her purpose. And the most surprising thing was that this discovery had come as a consequence of what had initially seemed her greatest sacrifice. That forced marriage that had now transformed into the most authentic and nurturing relationship she had ever known. James was changing too. He increasingly delegated responsibilities in his company, trusting in a renewed team after the crisis provoked by David's betrayal. He had begun to play guitar, rediscovering the musical passion he had inherited from his mother and abandoned after her death. His fingers, initially clumsy, were recovering the melodies she used to interpret as the sun set over the Atlantic. Not everything was perfect, of course. There were arguments about money. Emily resisted depending completely on James's fortune for her bookstore. About family, the issue of visiting Emily's parents in Connecticut remained a sensitive topic. About how to build a future when they came from such different worlds. One particularly tense night, after a heated discussion about whether they should invest in expanding the bookstore, Emily went out to the garden to clear her thoughts. The cold November air cut her skin, but she needed that icy bite to calm down. James found her seated on the bench beneath the cherry tree, now bare of leaves. Without saying anything, he sat beside her and placed a blanket over her shoulders. They remained in silence for long minutes, listening to the murmur of the creek and the distant hooting of an owl. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I still try to control everything, don't I?" Emily turned to look at him. Under the silvery moonlight, his profile seemed sculpted in marble, but his eyes, when they met hers, were full of a warmth that melted any resentment. "And I'm still too proud to accept help," she admitted with a small smile. "We make a good pair." James laughed softly, and the sound was like music in the night stillness. "We're a disaster," he corrected, "but we're learning, together." And that was the true miracle, thought Emily. Not that they loved each other, but that they were willing to unlearn old patterns, to build something new from the broken fragments of their previous lives. That each argument, each misunderstanding, Each moment of frustration, instead of separating them, brought them closer because they chose to stay, chose to face the discomfort, chose to grow. "You know what I thought the first time I saw you in your office?" Emily asked, resting her head on James's shoulder. "That I was a heartless tyrant?" he ventured. "That too," Emily laughed. "But mainly I thought you were the loneliest man I had ever seen. There was an emptiness around you, something almost palpable." James nodded slowly. "I was," he admitted. "Completely alone, even surrounded by people, until you came." They kissed under the stars, reconciled once more. And as they returned to the house, hand in hand, Emily understood that true love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing to stay day after day, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. In early December, they received an unexpected letter. It came from Australia, and the sender was Isabel Wilson, James's mother. Emily was present when he opened it, watching how his hands trembled slightly. The letter was brief but devastating in its simplicity. His father had passed away 3 months ago, and in his last days had expressed deep remorse for the way they had left things with James. Isabel, consumed by her own guilt, had finally gathered the courage to write to him, to ask forgiveness, to inquire if there might be any possibility of rebuilding at least a small part of what they had destroyed more than 20 years ago. James read the letter 3 times in silence, his face an impenetrable mask. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded strangely hollow. "She's 20 years too late." Emily said nothing. Knowing any response would be insufficient in the face of the ocean of pain that letter had reopened. During the following days, James immersed himself in a meditative silence. He spent hours playing guitar, repeatedly interpreting the melodies he remembered from his mother. Emily respected his space, understanding that some wounds require solitude to heal. A week later, while they prepared dinner together, James suddenly said, "I think I should respond to her." Emily continued chopping vegetables, waiting for him to continue. "Not for her, not even for my father," he clarified, "but for me, to finally be able to close that door and move forward." "What are you going to tell her?" Emily asked softly. James reflected a moment, the knife motionless on the cutting board. "The truth," he responded finally, "that what they did hurt me deeply, that pain defined 2 decades of my life, that I learned to live without them, though I never stopped missing them." He paused, searching for words. "And that thanks to you I finally understood that forgiveness isn't something granted to others, but a gift one gives to oneself." Emily set aside what she was doing and approached to hug him. She could feel something being released inside James, like an invisible chain he had carried for half his life beginning to loosen. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "And I love you," he responded, his voice vibrating against her cheek, "for teaching me that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the deepest form of courage." And thus, as the year neared its end, James and Emily found themselves building not just a house, not just a bookstore, but a life together. Their life cemented not in a contract, but in a daily choice, not in duty but in desire, not in fear but in hope. Winter descended upon the Hamptons with unexpected ferocity. Snowfalls that isolated the town for days, winds that howled around the house like hungry spirits, temperatures that dropped below freezing during the long nights. But inside their home, James and Emily had created a warm refuge where the exterior adversity only seemed to strengthen the bond between them. Mornings began with shared coffee by the window, observing how the early light transformed the snow into a blanket of diamonds. Afternoons, when Emily returned from the bookstore, passed with readings aloud in front of the fireplace, chess matches James was teaching her to play, or simply conversations that extended late into the night, constantly discovering new layers in each other, new stories to share, new dreams to weave together. But not all storms were external. On a Tuesday in January, Emily received a call that left her pale. Her younger brother, Matthew, had suffered a motorcycle accident in Connecticut. Nothing serious, they assured her, but he would need an expensive surgery to avoid mobility problems in the future. The insurance didn't cover the complete procedure. "I can provide the money today itself," offered James when Emily explained the situation. "Just tell me which account to transfer it to." It was the obvious solution, the simplest, but Emily hesitated. "I don't want my family to depend on you," she said finally. "You already saved my father once. This is different. "How is it different?" asked James, genuinely confused. "It's your brother. He's hurt. We have the means to help him." "Precisely," Emily insisted, her voice hardening. "You have the means. I'm just—" She stopped, but the unspoken words hung between them. "Your wife of convenience? The poor girl you saved? The recipient of your charity?" James looked at her as if she had slapped him. "Is that what you think?" he asked quietly. "After all this time, after all we've built together, you still see yourself as someone separate from me, someone who has no right to what is ours." "It's not that simple," Emily protested, tears of frustration forming in her eyes. "My father already feels indebted to you for life. If I now appear as the savior, thanks to your money, and you'd prefer your brother not receive the best possible treatment just to protect your father's pride." James's tone had become cold, disturbingly reminiscent of the man she had met that first day in the glass office. They looked at each other across a sudden abyss, both hurt, both unable to completely understand the other's position. "I'll go to Connecticut," Emily announced finally. "I need to see Matthew, talk to the doctors directly." "I'll accompany you," said James. "I'd prefer to go alone." The words fell like stones in a pond, creating ripples of tension around them. James nodded stiffly, turning his back to look out the window. His profile outlined against the winter light seemed carved in ice. "As you wish." Connecticut was as beautiful as always, its tree-lined streets bathed in the midday sun, Yale University visible in the distance. But Emily barely noticed the familiar beauty as she headed to the hospital where Matthew had been admitted. Her childhood home was just a few blocks away, but she decided to visit her brother first. She found him in a shared room, his leg elevated in a complex pulley system, but his spirit intact. "Look who's come to see the invalid," he exclaimed upon seeing her. "The lady of the great mansion deigns to visit the commoners." Emily smiled despite her anguish, recognizing the irreverent humor that had always characterized her younger brother. She sat by the bed, taking his hand. "How are you really, Matt?" He shrugged, trying to downplay his situation, but Emily perceived the concern behind his carefree facade. "The doctor says I need a complicated surgery if I want to run again someday," he explained. "Something about ligament reconstruction. Very expensive, as you can imagine." "I can help you," Emily said without thinking. Matthew looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something darker, something too much like resentment. "You or your millionaire husband?" he asked, with an edge to his voice Emily had never heard him use with her. "What difference does it make?" she asked, unconsciously repeating James's argument. "All the difference in the world, sis," Matthew responded, looking away. "All the difference in the world." The visit to her parents' house wasn't better. Her mother hugged her with the same warmth as always, but her father maintained an emotional distance she found painful. The conversation during dinner was tense, full of uncomfortable silences and deliberately avoided topics. Finally, when her mother retired to the kitchen to prepare coffee, Emily was left alone with her father in the small living room, where she had spent so many afternoons of her childhood reading in the old armchair by the window. "Why didn't your husband come?" her father abruptly asked. The question caught her by surprise. "He wanted to come, but—" She hesitated, not wanting to reveal the argument. "I thought it would be better to see you first alone." Her father nodded slowly, passing a hand through his graying hair with a gesture she knew well, one that indicated discomfort. "You know what's hardest, Emily," he said finally. "It's not owing him money. It's not knowing my daughter is married to a man to whom I practically sold her when I couldn't protect my family." His voice broke slightly. "The hardest thing is seeing how you've become part of a world to which we will never belong." The words hit Emily with physical force. Suddenly she understood the pain that was feeding her family's resistance, the same resistance she herself felt every time James offered financial solutions to problems that previously would have seemed insurmountable. It wasn't pride, as James had thought. It was fear of separation, fear that the abyss between their worlds would become so wide they could no longer reach each other across it. That night, in the small bedroom of her childhood, Emily called James. Upon hearing his voice, all the defenses she had maintained during the day collapsed. "You were right," she said through tears, "but you were also wrong. And so was I. We all are." "Emily," James's voice, even through the phone, was an anchor in the storm. "Tell me what you need." What she needed, she realized, was a bridge Not just money for Matthew's surgery, but a bridge that would allow her family to cross the abyss they felt between themselves and James's world. A bridge that would allow them to maintain their dignity, their identity, even while accepting the help they desperately needed. "I need you to come," she said simply. "I need you to really meet my family, for them to meet you. Not as the powerful businessman who settled my father's debt, but as the man who plants cherry trees and plays guitar at sunset. As my husband." James arrived in Connecticut the next morning. He appeared at the door of her parents' modest house without a suit, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, bringing a guitar and a box of pastries from the local bakery Emily had once mentioned as the favorite of her childhood. That day marked a turning point. James sat in her in-laws' living room and spoke openly about his own humble origins, about his minor grandfather, about how money and power had been for him not objectives in themselves, but tools of protection. He played guitar after dinner, interpreting traditional melodies that Emily's father also knew, creating a common ground where they could meet as equals. They visited Matthew together in the hospital, and James spoke to him not as the generous benefactor but as the brother of his wife, concerned about his recovery. And when the issue of the surgery arose, he proposed a solution that respected everyone's dignity. An interest-free loan that Matthew could repay when he was recovered and working again, not to James personally, but to a fund they would establish together to help other young people in similar situations. Back in the Hamptons, with the snow falling softly on the windshield as they traversed Long Island, Emily observed James's profile, intermittently illuminated by the road lights. "Thank you," she said simply. He took her hand without taking his eyes from the road. "I'm sorry I didn't understand before," he responded. "I've always seen money as a tool, something neutral that simply solves problems. I never really considered how it can create barriers, how it can make people feel diminished." Emily squeezed his hand, feeling that something fundamental had been healed between them. "And I never really considered what it means to share a life," she admitted. "I kept thinking in terms of yours and mine, as if we had to keep our worlds separate to protect ourselves." They looked at each other briefly, a gaze laden with understanding and mutual forgiveness. "We're learning," said James, repeating the words that had come to symbolize their relationship. "Together." And as the house appeared before them, warm and welcoming under its blanket of snow, Emily knew they had overcome one of the most difficult tests of their relationship, not by eliminating the differences between their worlds, but by learning to build bridges across them, to honor their distinct origins while constructing a common future. That night, as the storm increased outside, they loved each other with a new intensity, as if the shared vulnerability during those days had deepened their connection, revealing deeper layers of intimacy they hadn't yet explored. And afterward, in the quiet of the bedroom with James's measured breathing beside her, Emily understood she had finally found what she had always sought without knowing it. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect story, but a love strong enough to withstand storms, flexible enough to adapt to changes, deep enough to accept all their contradictions and complexities. A real love. Spring came again to the Hamptons, more vibrant than ever. The trees in the garden covered themselves with tender buds, wildflowers dotted the lawn with explosions of color, and the cherry tree James had planted a year earlier showed its first pink blossoms, promises of future beauty. Emily paused beside it, gently caressing the branches. It was hard for her to believe that just 2 years earlier she had entered that glass office, trembling with fear and resignation, to sign a contract that had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. They had been 2 years of transformation, of demolition and reconstruction, of painful learning and unexpected joys. 2 years in which both had discovered that true love wasn't the absence of conflict, but the willingness to go through it together. It wasn't perfection, but the capacity to accept each other's imperfections. It wasn't the unbridled passion of novels, but the conscious decision renewed each morning to choose each other. The story corner was thriving. Emily had hired an assistant, a young literature student named Lucy, who shared her passion for children's books and had a special talent for storytelling sessions. This allowed her to dedicate 2 days a week to a new project, a creative writing workshop for teenagers from disadvantaged families, funded with the money from the fund they had created for Matthew's surgery. James had also found a new balance. He continued directing his company, but now did so with a different perspective, prioritizing not just profitability, but also social impact and the well-being of his employees. He had created a foundation to support young entrepreneurs from humble origins, offering them not only funding but mentorship and access to networks that otherwise would have been closed to them. And to everyone's surprise, including his own, he had begun teaching business economics at a local university 1 day a week, discovering an unexpected pleasure in sharing his knowledge with young, enthusiastic minds. His relationship with Emily's family had gradually evolved. Matthew, completely recovered thanks to the surgery, had accepted a job in James's foundation, where his unique perspective and natural irreverence proved surprisingly valuable. Emily's parents visited their home in the Hamptons once a month, and although cultural differences still existed, they had found common ground based on mutual respect and shared love for Emily. James had also taken a significant step in his own healing process. After months of cautious correspondence, he had invited his mother to visit them. Isabel Wilson, an elegant 60-year-old woman with the same dark hair as James, now completely silvered, had arrived from Australia with a mixture of hope and fear. The reunion had been complex, laden with contradictory emotions, resentment and longing, pain and nostalgia, reproaches and apologies. It hadn't been a fairy tale ending with instant reconciliation, but the tentative beginning of something new, an adult relationship between two people deeply wounded by the past, but willing to build a different future. Isabel had returned to Australia, but they now maintained regular telephone conversations, and there was the possibility she might permanently move to the United States in the near future. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the grass. James was approaching from the house carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. He was smiling, that smile that even after so much time still made her heart race. "A penny for your thoughts," he said, offering her one of the cups. Emily accepted it, enjoying the warmth that filtered through the ceramic to her fingers. "I was thinking about how much has changed," she responded. "About how something that began so badly could transform into something so beautiful." James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He sat beside her on the bench beneath the cherry tree, his shoulder brushing hers, a contact so familiar yet so precious. "Do you regret anything?" he asked. And Emily detected a vulnerability in his voice that revealed that, even now, he sometimes doubted he deserved her. "Nothing," she responded firmly. "Every step, even the painful ones, brought us here." They remained in silence, drinking their tea while the afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the garden. Emily rested her head on James's shoulder, feeling his measured breathing, the constant beating of his heart. "I have something for you," he said after a moment. From his pocket he extracted a small blue velvet box. Emily held her breath as he opened it, revealing a ring with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds set in white gold. "But we're already married," she said, confused. James smiled. "We married because of a contract," he responded. "I want us to marry by choice, without pressures, without debts, without obligations, just because we love each other and want to spend the rest of our lives together." Emily's eyes filled with tears as James knelt before her, holding the ring. "Emily Taylor, would you do me the extraordinary honor of marrying me again? Of renewing our vows, but this time based solely on the love we've built together?" "Yes," she whispered, tears now freely flowing down her cheeks. "1,000,000 times, yes." James slid the ring onto her finger and then embraced her with such force it almost cut off her breath. When they finally separated, both were laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "Do you know what the pearl means?" he asked, caressing the ring now on her finger. Emily shook her head. "It emerges from pain," James explained. "A grain of sand, an irritation, enters the oyster and wounds it. And the oyster, instead of rejecting it, wraps it layer after layer, transforming something that causes pain into something beautiful." Emily understood the metaphor instantly. They had done exactly that. They had taken the pain, distrust, fear that each carried within and transformed it into something precious through patience, understanding, and love. They kissed beneath the branches of the cherry tree as the sun began to set, tinting the sky with the same orange and pink tones they had contemplated together in Miami during that trip that had marked the beginning of their true connection. And in that perfect moment, Emily understood they had arrived at the end of a chapter of their story, but also at the beginning of a new one, equally exciting and full of possibilities. A chapter they would write together, day by day, with the wisdom acquired through all the trials they had overcome and all the joys they had shared, because true love wasn't a final destination, but a continuous journey. It wasn't finding someone perfect, but creating something beautiful from shared imperfections. It wasn't the absence of walls, but the courage to tear them down together, time and again, until nothing remained between them except the naked truth of who they really were. "I love you, James Wilson," she whispered against his lips. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." "And I love you, Emily Taylor," he responded, his grey eyes reflecting the sunset light and a happiness so deep it seemed to illuminate him from within. "More than I ever believed it possible to love someone." And as they walked back to the house hand in hand, under a sky slowly filling with stars, both knew with absolute certainty that they had found not just love, but a home in each other. Her home they carried within, that no one could ever take from them, that would remain unbreakable through all the storms and calms life might bring them in the future.